My name is Sherry Kiesecker. I'm a mom of two. I have a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old. And I'm here because I'm very concerned about all the data that's collected from these tests and just in general in the classroom. Student data privacy is something that we need to be addressing first and foremost because technology has gotten way ahead of current laws. And there is nothing to regulate the data from these PARCC tests. Even federal laws don't cover what data is collected on the PARCC test and on the CMAS test. Everything that children do at school, even at home, can be tracked and recorded, shared and sold to outside vendors. It's not like the old days where it used to stay in the school. To quote one of these ed tech companies that collects data on children, he says, "Education today is the world's most data mineable industry by far, and it's not even close. They get 5 orders of magnitude more data on a child than Google does when you search something on Google. 5 to 10 million data points per day per child that parents have no idea is being collected, can't see, yet it can be shared and sold." So with data being a $3 trillion a year industry, I think the very least we can do is make that transparent and let parents know what data is being collected. Ask those vendors to tell us what data they have on our children and who gets to see it.
As someone who's heard these debates at the legislature before, I have a couple questions for you guys. Want to see what you think or how you would respond to this. We've heard in the course of having debates on public policy that, let me start with the achievement gap. A lot of people have said that the move towards standardized testing and measuring this course has been because we have an achievement gap. You can't manage what you can't measure. And so I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts about what do you say to those that say we can't roll this back because we need that in order to identify and fix the achievement gap?
So, I oftentimes I think that we hear the question of, well, how will we have accountability if we don't have tests? What are we going to have accountability? And I don't know of any other profession that has more accountability than education, because teachers are held accountable by their 160 students that they see every day, particularly at the high school level. They're held accountable by all those parents. Then they're held accountable by their administrators, which is a growing number, growing percentage in the education arena, more administrators. And they have superintendents, and then they have locally elected school boards. That is an adequate level of accountability for educators. What we've done in high stakes testing reforms is to say we're going to discount all those citizen engagement levels of ensuring that our students are learning what they need to do, our teachers are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and instead we're going to put all of our trust into these test publishers that then are allowed to operate without any accountability whatsoever. And this idea that we've diverted the very important role and responsibility of educating our children away from parents, teachers, students, elected school boards, and put that in the hands of publishers is a decline in accountability, not an increase in one.
And I think we know what we need, what best practices are as far as how children grow academically and personally. We know that it's involves parents. We know that it's not brains flooded with cortisol. And I think what we've been doing is creating such stressed out environments for everyone involved in public education. We know that if we had smaller class sizes, we would have a more differentiated education. We'd have teachers who were more attuned to their students. I feel like what we've done is taken tests and made them the measure, even though we have research and science that says that's not what makes for a good education, that's not what grows students.
Well, I would really like for legislators to consider the negative long-term potential consequences for children and families if these tests continue to be administered in the way that they have been. And I'd also really like to see a return to an authentic learning environment that really caters to the diverse needs of learners.
In terms of the achievement gap, the emphasis has really been on the data. We need all the data. And what we're missing is what the data says about what's happened to the achievement gap. And here in Colorado, it really illustrates a trend that's happening all over the nation. And since we adopted the No Child Left Behind, in Colorado, we have doubled the number of identified at-risk children. So rather than, in fact, narrowing the achievement gap, significantly increase the achievement gap. And there are several reasons why that's happened, but the number one reason is that we have a model of accountability that says quality equals test scores. And yet the number one correlating factor to test scores is socioeconomic status. So in effect, what we've done is we've rewarded children, schools, districts that have a lot of resources, and we've subsequently punished those schools, students, teachers that are working in high poverty areas.
There's another issue that's very emotional even to me, which is this flip side of school choice, where sure, parents can choose schools in theory, but schools, the flip side is that schools can choose kids, and they do. And it's not an equitable system, and schools use, or misuse rather, test scores to select winners, like they're building a roster for a NFL team or something. It's completely unfair. It must be illegal, and I would like to see a law that specifically says and puts schools and administrators on notice that if they engage in that kind of activity, they're breaking a Colorado law.
Got it.
And then lastly, I think in these 15 years I've taught science under No Child Left Behind, I've seen my subject really put on the back burner, and I want to see that change. In some cases, I don't think it's hyperbole to say NCLB eradicated science education in elementary schools. I've seen that, and especially on that issue of equity, especially in schools that are not performing according to the test scores, science is out the door.
It's a little ironic when you consider an increased emphasis on STEM or STEAM, science, technology,
Yes.
right? Well, we're realizing
Right.
that it's more important than ever, and yet, ironically, that seems to be a casualty of what we're talking about here. What would you like us to work on next session?
I would like to see teachers be able to teach, teachers to be able to use their toolkits of best practices, of proven best practices that they've developed over the years.
The only other thing, and I don't even know if we bring this up, and this is kind of more to your point, is like, we have yet to see anything that says these tests are reliable or valid. And so until they can show me that these tests are doing anything, like there's been nothing to support these tests, and we're spending millions of dollars on them.
And I just wanted to throw in as something I think is really important for legislators to hear, that this is really a parent-driven revolution. These are really parents like myself and like most people here who have seen what their kids are doing in school, have seen the effect that it's having on our kids, and are saying, we want none of this. We don't like it. We want no more. We are saying no. And you've seen in our state and also nationally, the opt-out levels in the last couple of years rising, rising, rising. In fact, in most states, the longer they've had these tests, the greater the opposition is and the larger the numbers are. So I really think it's important for legislators, when they're writing their bills, thinking about this issue, to know that there is a growing body of parents
And
that are
students.
speaking,
A
parents
student
and
revolution
students,
as
and
well.
teachers.
right?
And teachers.
But teachers have a little bit of a problem. It's hard for teachers, parents and to some extent students when they're older. They're the ones who are looking at these tests and saying no and refusing. And one of the strongest powers that we have is saying, we don't like this. It is bad for us. We say no. And I think legislators have to listen to that and look at those numbers and say, let's see where the tide is going here. There is a very, very strong movement afoot that is not happy.
Yeah, well, and definitely I can say I've seen it. I've heard it from my own community. I think we've heard it in people testifying, and I think one of the great things about your point that you're making is the whole reason to get citizens to engage is, legislators need to hear parents, but if we're not hearing from parents, if people assume that someone else is raising this issue, if someone else is advocating, if someone else is meeting with their legislator, most of us didn't really start to hear from parents in an organized fashion really until the last year. Here and there, people were starting to share some anecdotes, but they weren't sure where to go, who to talk to, what the next steps are. So I would just say that the most important thing that people can do as far as being heard is don't assume that someone else is already having the meetings, or someone else is doing the writing, or someone else is going to show up to testify. Because when we do have a critical mass of parents who come forward and say, this isn't working, changes start to happen. And without it, changes don't happen. So I think that's ultimately the point of why it makes a difference to engage and to contact people, and then it will make it at least more probable that as they're looking at how they're going to vote on certain bills and how they're going to go on the process, they will remember each of you by name and by face and your background about what your concern was and why it was important to you and why it was a real world problem for people. And when we don't hear from citizens, we will hear from people who are lobbying for high stakes testing, who basically lobbied to get us in this place, because many of those people are paid to be at the Capitol full time. And so what you're doing here today by meeting with me is very important. And I think this is one of the most effective things that parents can do with any of their elected officials to make sure that they are being heard. So I just want to thank you again for taking the time. And I think we've got a couple ideas of, there's some state-based things we can do. I think there's a need to think through federal changes on No Child Left Behind. And I think you've done the work to identify the problem. I think you've identified a lot of potential solutions. And so at this point, I think we're at the point of looking at what are deadlines, what are next steps, and how do we get started.